Hello, friends. On behalf of the IIMA Alumni Special Interest Group and IIMA Alumni and External Relations Office, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to today's online healthcare roundtable. Today's topic, scaling India's MedTech from innovators to global unicorns, could not be more timely. We have been reading about many medtech innovations, promising startups and growing domestic demand. But then, as yet, how many have scaled globally? What does it take to move innovation to global competitiveness? How do policy, regulations, academia, and industry come together to make it happen? To discuss these and other related issues, we have an illustrious group of professionals with rich experience in the field. As our moderator today, we have Mr. Rajiv Sharma, Managing Director of Sterling Accuris Wellness Private Limited. And I am alumnus from the batch of 1996. Rajiv brings over 3 decades of leadership experience across healthcare delivery and medical devices. He played a pivotal role in scaling Sterling Hospitals into Gujarat's largest hospital chain and went on to co-found Sterling Accuris Diagnostics, now the state's largest pathology lab network. Rajiv, with his practitioner perspective across operations and scale, will be steering the discussion. Welcome to this event, Rajiv. I will
Thank
now
you.
introduce our guest speakers on the panel, two distinguished global voices in medtech innovation and investment. First, Professor Alok Mishra. Alok is CEO of Value Addition and Adjunct Associate Professor at Duke-NUS Medical School. Alok has spent over 20 years with Johnson & Johnson Medical in Asia Pacific and brings a rare combination of industry leadership, academic engagement, and commercialization expertise. An IIMA alumnus batch of 1983, he is a trained pharmacist and has been deeply involved in building bridges between research, innovation, and real-world impact. Joining him is Professor Abel, Chairman of Advanced MedTech Investments. Abel is a seasoned global medtech investor and former senior executive with organizations such as Hillrom and Singapore's EDB. He is adjunct professor at NTU. He is a respected commentator on healthcare innovations and co-founder of the Asia Pacific Mentors Circle, a platform nurturing the next generation of healthcare leaders. Welcome to this discussion, Alok and Abel. And with that, I invite Rajiv to take the discussion forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Lasji, and welcome, Abel and Alok. It's a wonderful platform, and the topic for today is to discuss the scaling of India's medtech, uh, becoming from innovators to becoming global unicorns. Now, we are aware that there have been certain examples that we have seen in India, wherein Indian companies have been able to reach this level, but there aren't many such examples that we can really quote. So there are examples like Merrill, there are examples like Healthium, and a few others, and we'll talk about them as we go along. But I think the important point is that what has really worked for them, and understanding from let's say international ecosystems such as Singapore and US, which are much more evolved, what learnings can be taken by India as to develop that kind of ecosystem that can spawn many more unicorns. That's what we are going to discuss today. But before I do that, let me take a very brief outlook stab at what has happened in medtech industry in India. So, as Ullasji mentioned, I've been in healthcare for about 30 years, out of which about 11, 12 years, initial 11, 12 years of my career, I was in medical devices in J&J. And in fact, for record, Alok was my boss in J&J. And thereafter, I shifted to, let's say, healthcare services, and I've looked at medtech from a very different lens. So what has happened in last 30 years in India is that obviously, the economy has done very well. The GDP has grown by more than 10 times. We had an aging population. The aging population, if you see from let's say 2000 onwards or 1990, mid 1990 onwards, have almost tripled. That is the population of consumers above 60 years. You see that there is a huge investment in healthcare infrastructure that has happened, both because of policy initiative by the government and even through private investment. So, for example, if I look at last 15 years, the number of beds have gone up by almost 500,000. The number of medical colleges have almost doubled. So have the seats in MBBS and MD and DM. So we have many more practitioners, and the other thing that has happened is financial access. That is another factor that has really driven the growth in med devices. So insurance coverage has gone up. Government scheme like PMJY have been one of the critical success factor in driving growth in healthcare services and also in medtech. There are a lot of government policy push, which we'll talk about on the way, because I think I don't want to spend too much time in the beginning on that, like medical device rules, PLI or PRIP scheme, etc. That we'll talk about. So on an overall basis, if you look at it, if I were to say that the industry is around $12 billion, and through this intervention, the government expect that it will grow to about $50 billion in 6 years. So $12 billion in, let's say, FY24 to growing to about $50 billion. That's a kind of target that government has set up. And primarily that will happen because the growth rate works out to be about 27% if you look at it. That will happen by import substitution. So what has happened is that we are primarily medtech sector in India is dependent on imports, almost 80% import. Now I think it has come down to about 60-65% is what I understand. But the idea is that through all these interventions, it will go down to less than 50%. Despite all this happening, one thing which is very interesting about medtech industry in India is that there are about 800 manufacturers. Okay, and barely about 2% of them can fall, or that only 2% of them fall into, let's say, a unicorn. So there are globally, the data that I collated, there are about 140 unicorns, and barely about 4 or 5 from India fall into that category. And primarily it is US which leads the way, and Europe, which are basically producing the maximum number of unicorns. So what has happened is that, despite a great opportunity, only limited number of companies have really been able to be successful and scale up to a level so that they can become a global corporation, and they can become a unicorn. And that's what we're going to discuss today, that what we can do to really have more and more companies scale up to the level that they can become unicorn. So I think what I'll do is I'll start by asking a leading question to both Alok and Abel. Maybe Alok, you have a stab at it first. That what is your assessment of the medtech ecosystem in India, and what we could learn from, let's say, the lead markets like Singapore or US?
Great. Thanks a lot, Rajiv, and thanks Ullas, Sudarshan, everyone to have us on this panel. I really look forward to chatting with all of you. So if I look at India's medtech ecosystem, I think there are 3 ways or 3 stages you can look at it from. The first one is factor advantages, as you mentioned, aging population, a lot of people and things like that, the ecosystem integration, and then where can we go from here in terms of being unicorns or being innovation leadership, which we talk about. So some of the strengths definitely are there. That demand side, you cannot argue. You've got a 1.4 billion population, rising chronic disease burden. Unfortunately, a lot of it is going to need surgery, cardiovascular, orthopedics, cancer, and of course, diabetes, the mother of all of these. But one thing which I think is a big strength of India, which we sometimes don't think about as much, is this DNA of cost engineering. When we talk about it as jugaad and things like that, but it is so pervasive through all of us. And I remember talking to Dr. C.K. Prahlad once. He was in Hong Kong with us, and I said, so what is core competency? He says, core competency is not a department. It is something which everyone already has. It's in your DNA. And I think if we look at that, that is something which we will need going forward, not just for India, but even for other emerging markets. And even if you look at the US and all, they're all struggling, everyone trying to push down costs. The other strength I think the ecosystem already has is the digital infrastructure, what has been done with Ayushman Bharat, the health IDs for over 1 billion citizens, and the data coming out of that, which is going into some of the platforms we talk about. And the energy you see around the AI talent pool, I think that is going to be one of the big assets we have. And then again, Rajiv, as you mentioned, the policy momentum, the PLI schemes which we have, and people have started making things, including MRI and CT scanners. And why those are important is when I was looking at the import bill, those were the two big items, other than, of course, cardiac implants and things. So that's very important. And then you've got the MedTech, Mitra, Biopharma, Shakti, all of those things. And more importantly, I think it's just been 9-10 days when they announced the SAHI, SAHI, and the board for AI governance. I think these are going to be amazing because I don't think there's any large country which has still come out or has been so fast in coming out with a governance structure aimed at protecting the patient as well as having good governance around AI. And the board, which is going to be, it's already there, created by IIT Kanpur, where you can actually validate many of the devices you have in an anonymized way with the data which is coming out of many of the digital institutes. So I think there's a lot of great strengths we have. Now coming, as you said, to the bottleneck part of it, one, you already mentioned import dependency. And interestingly, this dependency for the more expensive, higher-end devices is on US and Germany. Germany more capital equipment, US for implants and stuff. And the low cost goes to China. So these are the two different areas where we are dependent. And we'll have to think how we can, overcome this. And possibly some early unicorns can come from here, because if we can send satellites to Mars, I'm sure we can make MRIs and CT scanners. So that's one part of it. Other one, I think people talk about this as a bottleneck. I don't know whether it's a bottleneck, the regulatory fragmentation to some extent, because the CDSCO is modernizing. They've done a lot of great work. They've got guidelines for SAMD, SIMD. There's still a difference in the timelines we see compared, and you said Singapore and US for a 510K, maybe 3 to 6 month cycle, similarly Singapore. But I won't push that too much, because in my experience, and I was in India when for the first time they started talking about device regulation back in 2006 and 7, it takes time to build that regulatory talent pool and come up to speed. And same I encountered in Singapore, because I used to be the chairman of medical devices here also. It takes time, and I think it will happen. But the way they've gone about it, I think, makes sense, that they're looking at C and D devices at a central level, and the A and B, they're letting the states do it, because otherwise there will be too much load. And of course, everything should be centralized, but handling it in one place is not going to happen. So people can talk about that as a bottleneck, but I think that is a good bottleneck, because unless you have a strong regulatory system, you will not be recognized globally for export.
Correct.
It's very, very important. It's like if you don't have great brakes, you cannot be in F1. So that's very important. The third part.
And then just want to add a point here. So India joined this International Medical Devices Regulatory Forum.
Yes, yeah.
In 2024. Do you think that was a great move?
That was a great move. That was a great move, because I remember I was, when I was in India, I was the chairperson of the CII MT, they call it MLED there. And I was in front of the Parliamentary Commission telling them that you should align with GHTF at that time. And we had conversations, but it's taken time, and it would take time in a place where the control has always been with the FDAs. But now they have aligned with that. That is very good. I think they also have a seat in IMDRF globally, which is, I think, very important. Because to be a big exporter, to become a unicorn, you need to have a regulatory system which everyone can say that, okay, it's come from India, it should be good. If that is not there, then forget it. It's not going to happen. I can guarantee you that. And that was the conversation even those days I used to have with the drug controller who was there. The last bottleneck I would like to talk about, because this is common to everyone, anyone who gets into MedTech, this is something they face. In India, there is an additional twist to that. And this bottleneck is about the lab to market journey. That how do you translate what the IITs and AIMs are doing, but commercialization which needs to happen, and that remains ad hoc. And it's not an easy journey because it's not just about funding or regulatory or clinical trials or health economic studies, but in our case, the context makes a big difference. So when you start launching, and this is very different from pharmaceuticals, that when you get a really good new medical device or technology, there are these barriers in it that, okay, first thing I have to put the infrastructure. So if I'm selling a computerized surgery, I have to first install that, right? So if I don't have the capital equipment, there's no surgery going to happen. Second is I have to personally go and train those people because no one else is going to get trained. So doctors, nurses, the biomedical engineers, everyone who's around that machine. So the type of work Da Vinci did, I'm told that around every Da Vinci computer, there has to be 5 people helping out to do that. So you have to do that from an access point of view. Then train the doctors. Then, of course, create awareness that patients actually go there. Now, one of the big challenges we always have in surgery is that GPs don't know how to refer to surgery because they've not been trained that this new surgery has come and you should send them here. So that is a big barrier. And finally, of course, affordability. So I actually, I think I have talked to you about this, the 4A's model I have.
4A, 5P, yeah.
And the reason is this, it starts from infrastructure availability, then it goes into training, then it goes into where the patient's coming. Affordability is the last. So many countries create, that bottleneck affordability they release first, but doesn't work because others are still there and doctors are not trained and equipment is not there, you're not going to get any surgery.
Right.
So that is something we need to look at, and maybe later on we can talk about how you develop the connections, how do you develop the ecosystem for people to mentor each other and things like that. So those I would say are the big bottlenecks there. Now you also asked about comparison with Singapore and US. I'll be very brief in that. Essentially in Singapore, again, I'm not saying Singapore is a benchmark in creating unicorns. I think we've created one in MedTech, Mirixis, which is over $1 billion market cap. Their strength is system coherence. So you've got over 60 global MedTech firms here, 400 health tech startups, a lot of programs, and I've been faculty in some of them like Stanford Biodesign and the Duke-NUS Health Innovators program. So they have compressed this innovation to market cycle. And the beauty about Singapore is no matter where you go, they all know what's going on. They're all very well connected. So no one struggles with trying to find, what I should be doing next. So that is important. And the ministry has been very involved in that. And I know Abel was a big part of that, of the MedTech side, right from 20 years back. And Singapore today accounts about 25% of Asia Pac's MedTech output, which is quite a lot. Given the size, it's like tiny compared to anyone else. On the other hand, US dominates with 40% of the global market. Now, the differences are the US, of course, is a big market. Half the world's market is there in most cases. But they have very deep capital markets, and their FDA is a gold standard regulator. So once they create something, the whole world will accept it. No regulator has a problem with that. India's edge is scale and cost, but we have to see how do we build these ecosystems and try to get everyone together. So that's, briefly what I would say.
Abel, up to you. What do you think what is your assessment of MedTech ecosystem in India, and what can we learn out of?
So first off, let me appreciate the IIMA Association, and thank you for the invitation and the great team that has set today's session up. To be absolutely candid, I really think that the Indian MedTech ecosystem has everything that it needs to create a whole generation of unicorns, right? And I maybe will build a little bit on what both Rajiv as well as Alok have said. I just would refer you to the panel discussion at the most recent India AI Summit, India AI Impact Summit, right? And I think Sundar Pichai, the CEO of Alphabet, was there, and he said this, right? He sees for India, specifically in AI, 3 things, right? Number 1, user base. Number 2, builders. And number 3, rule shapers coming from India. And he thinks that for AI, India will be able to do all 3. And I use this as a frame for potentially the next generation of MedTech unicorns. So, Rajiv, just to be a little bit more controversial, I would say this. I actually think that the way forward for Indian medical devices is not import substitution. I think that is yesterday's game. right? Because in my mind, import substitution assumes that your market that you're chasing is India, right? And I don't personally believe that if you want to build a unicorn today, that is the way that you would build in order to get to a unicorn valuation, right? Because I think that for the next generation of MedTech unicorns coming from India, I would suggest that from day one, right, from design, you should be planning for devices that are, number one, US ready. I think that Alok has said it absolutely right. Right, the first market that an Indian medical device company should chase should be the US market, right? Because they are the benchmark regulatory body around the world. And if you get an approval from the US Food and Drug Administration, I can tell you that every other discussion that you have on the regulatory side will be that much easier. And I'll give you one example. I Advanced MedTech Investments, this is the company that I chair. We have an investment in Bangalore in a company called ABM, Alpha Bravo Mongolia, respiratory care. And this is a company that in 3 years has built a 250 crore revenue, right? So that's about 30 million US dollars for a device called a respiratory care device. And it has done this amazingly with a team of less than 40 people in Bangalore. And in Bangalore, we do everything. We do R&D design, we do sustaining engineering, we do global regulatory, everything out of Bangalore. The only things that we don't do in Bangalore are two. Number one, we don't manufacture in Bangalore for supply chain reasons. And the second reason is that we do sales outside, right? 99% of our 250 crore of revenue is done in the US, right? And we're talking about tens of thousands of these devices delivered every year. And I share this because this is a company that from the very first day that they were born, right? And a guy called Vinay is the one that you can Google him, ABM Respiratory Vinay. This gentleman who came from IIT, from the very first day, developed the company, the design of the product for the US FDA. And I think that actually, if we have that kind of ambition, right, I think that that's maybe something to undergird us in that next wave of the journey, right? So this generation of medical device unicorns coming from India. And then I circle back to the framework that Sundar talked about, Sundar Pichai, right? Not just India as a market, but from a builder standpoint, how do we build AI native devices from the first day, right? And then the last one really is using the AI native devices. How do we continue to change and continue to innovate, right? And basically completely change the ball game of respiratory care or whatever device area that you decide to play into, right? I think this is the way tremendous value is created. And I spend a good bit of my time in India, at least 2-3 times a year I'm there, mostly in the Bangalore area. But I think that there's much to be done, and I'm very excited by the conversation today. And I do believe that a lot of the people who come through the IIM, IIT pathways will be able to go out and build these incredibly amazing companies. That's my personal feel.
You made some great points, Abel. Alok, this question is to you. Now, one thing in innovation and research is what we have seen even in US, or even I'm sure that's the case even in Singapore, that there is a very strong tie between academic institutions, medical schools, and corporates. And then it basically get to level of commercialization, quick commercialization. So what is your view on, what India can learn from, let's say, this kind of ecosystem in US and Singapore?
Right. No, that's a great question. In fact, I'll go back about 20 years and I think Abel and I were both involved in this similar type of thing. So I started off teaching a course which later on and still today Abel teaches in Nanyang Business School called Life Sciences, a Business Perspective. So essentially these were guys who were PhDs and they came from somewhere, had great ideas about life sciences, but they didn't know the business part. So the whole idea was to teach them. But then I took a group of students who interned with me, and then I think that was SARS time, 2003 or something. So I made them do some research and published a paper on that, because the whole idea was that innovation happens only if clusters form. And the cluster essentially in MedTech happens to be that you have to have engineers, doctors, and people with a business acumen. This three-legged stool has to be there, otherwise it doesn't work. So I sent them around, and as I tried to find out people who, and Nanyang was doing pretty good work, supposedly on medical devices. And I said, so, okay, where did your topic come from? How did you decide what to work on? And I found in most of the cases there wasn't any great connection between the clinical need, or many of them had created something, never even talked to a doctor. So at that time, I became very enamored with this. And Abel and I used to sit when he was in EDB, and I used to keep talking to him. And later on, I went to India, and I think, Abel, you might remember this grant you started called MedConcept, where the person from a hospital had to go to an engineering school and have a med device company, and then he would give them, I think, 300K or something. He had a budget of 6 million at that time. And then the whole idea was that now you work on this. So because you need all these three perspectives if you have to develop a device, because the clinical need and finding is very important, but the doctor cannot make the device. The engineer can make it, but the business person has to say whether this makes sense, whether this can sell, whether commercially it will be viable or not. So I think because of that perspective, I think it is very important that we connect academic institutions and medical schools. And I think Stanford by Design is a good example of that.
Yes, yes, yes.
Where you, I think in India by Design
AIMS and IIT Delhi, I think they have.
We started that, and I think that is the type of thing. Now you've got so many medical schools. I think that needs to be scaled now. I mean, what they were doing is good, but I don't know whether. And one of the challenges Stanford by Design is we still don't teach them commercialization. So they come up with a proof of concept type of thing, and then there is still this chasm which is there. So we need to take them from there. But at least on the innovation side, I think that's a great place. But what I would say is currently, I think, and because I went to this, I was one of the keynote speakers in this conference on MedTech devices held in India 2 years back with NIPER in Gandhinagar. And what I realized is most of the people who are presenting MedTech devices came from the IITs. There was almost no one coming from a medical school. And I think that is very important. The need comes from there, and they have to be sort of, joined at the hip to do this. So I think that is where I feel that there might be a lot of opportunity. So yeah, so that would be my perspective. There are other things we can talk about, like translational research offices and all that. But I think if this piece doesn't work, then you don't get innovations which really are marketable or are going to create an impact.
Yeah, but in let's say in Singapore, is there a specific model that is followed that all universities collaborate with?
Yeah, so we started with Singapore Stanford by Design, where EDB, A-Star, all of them helped us to start this. So that was started off. And the people from that program, if you come to Singapore, they're in the ecosystem. So the Henry Ho, who heads NHIC, he was from the first batch of Singapore Stanford by Design. The lady in Duke-NUS who I work with, Reena Dharmawan, I used to mentor her when she was in Stanford by Design, but she comes from that program. She's a head and neck surgeon, but she leads this innovation program. And she also is an engineer. So I have seen that all these people who came out of that went into the ecosystem. Now, they did not become startups. I think one or two did, but most of them didn't. But that wasn't the idea. The idea was, can we create people with that DNA in the ecosystem who will start thinking this way? Duke Health Innovators program, where I teach nowadays, has taken it a step further, and which is something which I was talking to you about, that the biodesign program does clinical needs finding. So this is very okay for markets where the rest of the access factors are not an issue. But in a place like India or LMICs, you need to do the access context needs finding also. So that's something we've added on as a phase to this. And therefore, they look at both the clinical needs part of it, plus whether it's going to work in the market, which you're talking about, whether it's Indonesia, Philippines. So it is everywhere. So if you came to Singapore, almost everyone would know that model, and they would be well versed with that.
Got it. Okay. Abel, anything you want to add to this?
The only thing that I would maybe add is I would just reinforce what Alok said about the need to have the trifecta, right? So the first one is you need a medical need. So a doctor would be great. You need an engineering solution. Ultimately, a device or software needs some kind of engineering solution. And then number three, I think you need a source of capital, right? And I think that for the magic to truly happen in medical devices, you need all three. And I think that actually in India, you actually have all three. My only consideration when I talk to the startups in India is that unfortunately, I think that you have a lot of very good doctors. I mean, the best doctors in the world come from India, right? And they go all over. This is clearly exportable talent, right? You look at Cedar Sinai in the US, or if you go to Cleveland Clinic, guess what? All the doctors, just look at the last names, and where they all originated from. Right. So I don't think that that's the issue. But I think that in my mind, to break through, as I said, to be able to get to unicorn status, I love, Rajiv, what you said earlier. Actually, the challenge that I find, I wish that we had a lot more of unicorns in India, right? But, you talked about Healthium earlier, right? I mean, ultimately, medical sutures company, right? But the company has been around for a long time. Right. So the question is, how do you accrete great value and how do you create exponential growth? And I think that, you have great medical people, you have great engineers. I think that if I might suggest, the quantum leap that we need to see is access to capital in India that makes the company international from the first day. Right. I personally don't believe that you will be a MedTech unicorn if you are a founder or startup today and you're only focusing on India-only problems. Right. I think you need to focus on global problems and you need to be able to solve these global problems in your startup in India today. And then I think you will get to a unicorn valuation. Because if you do it the other way around, right, it will take a very long time. And, we don't want I don't think that that's the best way to bring about an acceleration in the next generation of medtech unicorns in India. So just a thought. It's a bit of a kind of like a thought experiment in the sense that, again, with my Indian students or with the Indian startups that I often talk to, I find that we spend too much time looking at our constraints. Whereas if you look at, go to the Silicon Valley, or if you go to London, or if you go to Germany, to Munich, right? The startup founders instead look at where the opportunities are and how do they circumvent the opportunities by design, right? So, it's maybe a little bit of a cultural thing. Maybe it's, the extremely rigorous training that you get. But, I do see that there's a bit of it, that cultural, I can't because I'm constrained, as opposed to actually the constraints that we have, create great opportunities, right? And you are able to overcome them and have as a result of that, have a quantum leap.
Now, why we are at this scale up, and I agree with you that scale up requires capital. And for example, some of the success stories that we have seen from India, be it Merrill or be it Healthium, I mean, if you track their journey, they've raised private equity capital multiple rounds, and that's how they've been able to scale up. And I spoke to a few of them. And what I learned is they said one of the key thing was that they're able to do clinical studies to get product validation abroad. They were able to do, for example, clinical study for stents and other products, in Europe. That's what they told me is one of the key reason they were successful at global level. Now, in your opinion, and this question is to you, Abel, do you think Indian startup ecosystem is starved of funding, or do you think what you talked about, that they don't have the kind of global outlook that is needed to really attract the kind of funding that is needed to scale up?
I would answer that question in two ways, right? So actually, again, I'm glad that you mentioned Healthium, right? And if you talk to any of the people in Healthium that exited, right? So as you know, Healthium was invested by a British private equity company called Apex. I happen to know the entire team in Apex that did the deal, right? And eventually they sold to KKR, right? And everyone did super, super well. But I would say this, in my mind, what Healthium had done is they had already cracked the code and they knew what they wanted to be when they grew up, right? And what Apex basically did was they gave them the growth capital to allow them to accelerate kind of like the growth cycle, so to speak. My only consideration, and again, I would propose this for discussion. I think that with the Indian companies, I actually don't think that the issue is necessarily capital, right?
Okay.
Because actually you are living in a what I call a clinical trials hotspot. I'll give you another example. So there's a very, very basically an exploding medical device company in the US in the urology space called Calypso, right? They are very well known for a device called the CVAC, CVAC ureteroscope. And this device actually did all their clinical research to begin with in India, right? And I can tell you that the company now has only been around for about 7 years, and they're going to do super well whenever they exit. So I think it's funny for me that US exponential growth companies are coming to India to do their clinical trials, right? And then bringing the device and the data and the learnings back, and then they're rolling out the device overseas, right? So I would start more from the operating, assumption that we have everything that we need to build a global unicorn device company in India. The question only is, where do we source for capital? And I think that this is where I think your point is well taken. I think that we have a lot of founders who may not have the international networks, right? And I think that, conversations like this are great, right? People are Alok, people like yourself, Rajiv, right? And also happy to connect with people who would love to connect with me. I think that the more that we think outside of India in terms of the starting capital, I think that the better the companies we will generate coming from this batch of Indian startups, right? Because I think that if you just confine yourself to India, I think that you have to understand that fundraising is now a global business, right? If and everybody has all the tools, right? We live in the world of AI. Nothing stops you from kind of like spamming your investment proposal on LinkedIn to all the top VC firms in the world, especially if you have a global need, right? Obviously, if you go and say, look, I'm trying to solve this India-only medical problem that nobody cares about, right? Nobody will be interested, and shame on you, right? But if you solve, for example, I give you an example, right? If you come up with a solution for, I'll take Alok's point about intuitive surgical. If you come up with a solution for the next intuitive surgical in India, which is 10%, one rupee for every 10 rupees that for intuitive spends, I guarantee you have a ton of people looking at your proposal, right? So I think it's the size of the ambition. And with the size of the ambition, you are able to then bring on board ambitious capital, right? Because ambitious capital does not care where the companies are. I'll give you an example in advanced MedTech. We go anywhere in the world and we invest in any company that we feel has the ambition, right? So we are not geographically bound, so to speak. So I think that may be something for the group's consideration.
So I think now coming to global expansion, now this question is to both. Maybe we can start with Alok. That what are the 2 to 3 critical steps Indian medtech startups must take to really transition from local innovators to global unicorn? What's your views?
Right. I think the first thing is which Abel has very nicely.
Think global. That's what basically.
Yeah. No, so I think Abel put it very nicely that you design for the world.
Design
if you're able to get the price which India can get, I think you will win. See, and we know this, right? That if you want a low price thing to work, the main thing is you should be equivalent on quality. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So I think that is very critical, and that quality is communicated through the regulatory approvals you have. Abel talked about how you should go to the US FDA and get that as soon as possible. If as India gets recognized as being very, very good, that would be great. Singapore HSA is another place. So I think that would be very important. Design for the world and then price for India mindset, because we are very cost effective. And I remember when the time I spent in India, I mean, for 100,000 I could get more proof of concepts there than I could get for $1 million elsewhere. So there's a lot of innovation which can happen there. The second is this regulatory intelligence has to become a core competence, because if you have to go global, you have to know not just your guys, but FDA and everything. And using that competency in design phase is very important. While you're thinking here, you have to already think, if I do this, I'll end up with a de novo. And nowadays with AI, you can do all that search. That is, do I have enough, predicate devices for this or not? So those type of things I think will be quite important, because that speed is very, very different, between a 510K and a de novo type of thing. The other part, and I think a lot of Indian companies, and I've seen that even from the smaller companies from Singapore, don't do that very well sometimes, that when you go outside, the international commercial infrastructure you need cannot be done by just, I'll give it to some distributor and they will do it for me, because medical devices is not anything else. Here you have this whole thing of putting if it's the capital equipment, you have to put it there, you have to make sure it works, you have to make sure it is serviced, then you have to train people, and you have to do all of that. So, and again, apply for regulatory reimbursement, all of that. So you need to partner there rather than straight away go to some distributor. So initially partner, and then maybe later on you can think about, how do you expand. So that piece, because if you look at the MedTech world, essentially there are some, maybe there used to be 10, 11, now there are like maybe 7 or 8 of these large companies, and everyone else is at the other end of the market cap, which is startups with 2, 3 products. And these guys keep buying these out because they have this whole commercial presence. So the biggest moat here ends up being the width of your portfolio and the commercial infrastructure you have. So if you have to be a unicorn, a global unicorn, I think we'll have to start thinking of how will I build towards that. So that's what I would say is the 3 things which are very important.
Okay, Abel?
I think, Rajiv, my sense is this. I actually think that I mentioned this earlier. I think AI is the ultimate game changer,
Yeah.
right? I can tell you that now there are companies who are actually doing what you call AI GPT for regulatory, right? So I think that, and nothing stops, to be absolutely honest, nothing stops. It's not like ChatGPT says, I will not do any prompts from India, right? So actually, I think that you can have very sophisticated prompts, and we can have now with the onset of Claude Code and agents, we can actually have these agents assemble our regulatory packages for submission to the FDA, right? Which is for me the fundamental point. I think that at some point we in India need to have what I call a change of mindset, right? Do we want to continue to just be cheap labor for the world, right? We in the Tatas of the world, in the Wipros of the world, right? Or do we want to actually take our knowledge, take our intellectual property, and take our intelligence and create the next generation of startups where the value now doesn't accrue to a principal manufacturer? I mean, look at GE. They have thousands of engineers. Philips, thousands of engineers in Bangalore, right? But ultimately, where does the value accrete? The value does not accrete in India. The value accretes to the mother company, right? Because we are only their hands and legs. And my question ultimately is, these people are doing world-class R&D. I love the point that Alok made just now about, when he talked about like bottom of the pyramid. If you think about this whole concept of reverse engineering, I know it's really old now, where we created, a value segment ultrasound. We created a value segment ECG. Guess what? These ultrasounds and ECGs are available around the whole world now, and they were all developed in India, right? But who were the people that got the value from this? It was not an Indian startup company. These startups would be unicorns today if they had themselves taken it to market, all right? All the value went to some other, company outside of India, right? But actually all of the fundamental R&D, all the fundamental commercialization actually was done in India. So, I mean, I think that for me, the starting point really is, what is the size of our ambition? And then how do we fully leverage AI? Because all of the typical constraints that we had, expertise, regulatory mindset, know-how, all of that is gone, right? We live in the world of AI. If AI is doing your regulatory dossier, I assure you, everything that comes from your regulatory dossier is going to be done to the world standard, right? Obviously, you might have to pay some consultants to check it over, right? Or you have to have some smart capital to figure out who are the right people to talk to. But in my mind, that traditional limiting factor for Indian companies, right, is gone. And I think AI has eliminated it, which is the reason why the panelists have talked about why India as a country has decided to embrace AI so completely, because I do believe that we will have a quantum leap in not just medical devices, but potentially in other sectors as well.
So now coming to, I think both of you talked about the importance of regulatory, and so there've been a lot of policy and regulatory push in India, specifically in since 2014. So there was 100% FDI that was allowed. The medical device rules that were updated in 2017. There are a lot of medical device parks. Alok talked about having an ecosystem wherein you have everything can be done. So medical device parks have been set up, and productivity linked incentive scheme. And then, in 2024, there's this national medical device policy that is promulgated. What do you think, apart from these, Indian regulatory bodies or policymakers need to do to really, speed up the whole transition from innovators to creating successful companies? Alok?
Yeah, sure. So yes, and I've been involved with regulation a lot, being on the board of the Health Sciences Authority here, and of course managing this as a function. I think this is a very, very important function which has a very peculiar angle to it when it comes to a country level, and the reason is as follows: till regulation came in, no one in the country had any clue how do you even look at regulation, right? So the talent pool in that country is generally non-existent. There'll be pharmacists like me, but a pharmacist does not understand devices. He's not a biomedical engineer, he's not a doctor or a surgeon. And it takes time to build that talent bench. So I think one of the big things which India needs to do is how do you build that talent bench, both at the regulators level as well as the innovators level and the industry level. The other challenge is the innovators. They're tiny companies. They've got 3 people, as Abel said, with the full-fledged company has 40 people. They cannot afford a full regulatory person for 2 reasons. One, they won't find him. The second is, if you find him, he won't come to you for one product. What is he going to do? File that and then sit on it. So we need to find how do we build that type of talent, and how do we provide this as resource to this thing. In fact, yesterday I was on a call with the Center of Regulatory Excellence. In fact, India should look at that quite keenly. Duke-NUS has a Center of Regulatory Excellence which basically trains regulators, it trains a lot of people across Asia Pacific, and they're a very good resource from a competence building point of view. But there also the challenge is you cannot train the startup guy, because how many things will he absorb? He's usually
Absolutely.
The CEO is looking for money, and his number 2 is trying to get the product out. Those are the type of structures they have. So we have to find a way of how do we provide this as a service to them. So I think those were the things which I would think about. But there may be other things which need to be done. For example, one of them is mutual recognition agreements, the MRAs. So I know currently India, I think, has one with UK, but they should see whether HSA can be one of them, because HSA is very highly regarded. And maybe look at EU, Japan, Australia, ASEAN, wherever you can get those. Because that then suddenly, once you're approved in one country, then, recognize other places. So it sort of removes those barriers very quickly. And Abel talked very, very well about the AI part of it. And that is going to be, I think, the future. Because I don't think there's the time when we should get into developing surgical devices and stuff. One day we will do that. But where the world is going is AI. Now, that is where the regulators will have to find. And I think that is the intention with the SAHI, whatever they have launched recently. How do you give them a regulatory sandbox that they can look at all of this with some regulatory inputs and proctorship and guidance so that they don't mess up? Because if you're going to provide real guidance and diagnosis and stuff, things need to work. The BODH, the both part of it apparently has the validation thing. So there are those things which exist, but now someone has to help all of this to happen so that then they can be more successful. And because when they launch, it's not just about whether it's approved by regulators, because quite frankly, even regulators will be at a loss about AI. But the fact is, no patient should get harmed, and the thing should work well. So I think those 2 things will be quite important.
So, look, while we are here, I know you are connected with NIPER Ahmedabad.
Yeah.
And NIPER Ahmedabad, I think we have a center of excellence for medical devices.
Yes.
So do you think something which is, I think when you say center for regulatory excellence, do you mean something like that maybe at one place create a, you can say a common pool which is accessible to all startups? Is that what you have in mind?
I have a common pool in mind, and maybe Abel is a better person to answer this, but it will not sit in an institution. These are live people who are actually doing this, and they would be available to mentor and connect with people when they need to be done. So the connection is important, because there are too many connections here which one person cannot be trained on. But if suppose you had, maybe the institution could be a body which could help the connection.
Correct. That's what I meant, basically.
Because most people I find, and I work with a few from India startups who are looking at some sort of advice, and I just keep giving it to them free. But the point is, they'll say, okay, can you tell me where I can get advice on regulatory this thing? Can you tell me where I can get ISO 13485 certification? So they generally don't know where to go, because they're usually doing this for the first time. So I've looked around in India. I have not found one, center of excellence. So maybe Naipur can do that, but I don't know whether they have hired the people to do it. I know I talked with Shailen Saraf when I was there, because one of the things you will need is a person who understands the industry. So it has to be someone who's experienced, and then he can start building this part. But I don't have too many updates on that. I was there 2 years back. And
Abel, what's your view on this?
Rajiv, as an ex-government person, I will tell you this. I would not rely on government, right? So, and I just share, I think, there are very few industries, and I would say this, the medical device industry is cannot hold a candle up to the taxi cab industry, right? And you look at what Uber was able to do, right? Or Ola, or Grab, or any of these ride-sharing companies. They had to do and overcome enormous regulatory hurdles to become the successful companies that they are today. So I would say this. I would actually look for areas in the medical device world which are in such a desperate need that the regulators have no choice but to either come alongside with you, or at the very least keep an eye closed to actually help you to succeed, right? And if you come up with solutions like that, you will find that there will be more doors that open to you. But obviously, if you play in areas which are, highly competitive, where, everybody wants to kill you, right? I think that, maybe that's not the solution, the problem that you want to solve from the first day. Right. So I mean, I think I would just offer that as I would not hold my breath, I would actually look for what I call holes in the marketplace where you can play, and for which I'll give you back to the ABM respiratory care example that I shared earlier. Right. This is a device which is actually orphan product, right? I mean, there are only maybe about 20,000 devices sold in the US every year. Right. In the past, Philips was in the marketplace. ABM has actually done such a great job that Philips is no longer in the market for this product. Right. And it's not what you call a billion-dollar product, but it is one of many products that we will launch, right, in the journey to become a unicorn. So it's like I said, I think maybe just a slightly different way of thinking about things. Yeah.
Rajiv, if I can add one thing to that, there is one organization which was created. Now, I don't know whether it was very successful, but in the US, they created this thing called MDIC, the Medical Device Innovation Consortium. So this was a body between the FDA and sponsored by the industry, but an independent body where anyone could go to get advice on regulatory pathway strategy and all. Because usually startups and those people are very scared to go to the FDA directly, because they think, something will happen there. So that was created in between. And the last time I spoke with them, which was, of course, a long time back, they were very involved at that time with the digital and SAMD and things like that. So as we get into AI, there might be an opportunity to get people who are experts in this area. And as Abel is saying, not go everywhere, but in specific areas, some expertise, because to do this, you need to understand AI, and you need to understand what these guys are up to. You need to understand where code can go wrong and things like that. So that may be an opportunity. In Singapore, we also initiated that between HSA and Medical Technology Industry Group very recently. I'm not sure where it has gone, but they will need, but that is a good idea. Now, I don't know whether it will work, but that's a separate thing. Yeah.
So now I want to come to, I think both Alok and Abel talked about AI in a very big way, and something that can really lead the wave of, next set of unicorns from India. So again, the question first to Alok and then to Abel is that what are some of the moonshot opportunities or emerging technologies, for example, AI in healthcare, robotics, digital therapeutics, etc., where you see that India's strongest bets are for producing the next unicorn?
Right. So I think the first one, and I think Abel has dwelt on this quite a bit, is rather than going to very serious stuff, AI-powered diagnostics at point of care. I think that would be great because, as I said, in access, what happens is India has a big problem that the patient doesn't reach there because he's not screened and he doesn't know he has tuberculosis, doesn't know he has cataract, he doesn't know he has a retinal detachment, all those type of things. And India has actually done some of these. So there is one tool which there's a Harvard case on that called Parvai or something like that, where they created an AI-based iPhone app. And because when they did this 4A type of analysis, they realized that the biggest problem was not surgical capacity, but it was that patients were not going there. And this iPhone-based thing they gave to community health workers, and they went and screened, and suddenly they found in a couple of years, the number of cataract surgeries went up a lot, and people started getting benefit from that. There's another one which I think has been done, which is for screening for tuberculosis based on AI machine learning of the sounds there. And I'm very interested in this because I'm currently working, in Ben Avansina with him on a tuberculosis project in the Philippines, where again, this is the issue. The patient who's got tuberculosis doesn't get certified or notified as a TB patient and therefore doesn't get treated. So I think that may be one big area. Also, Abel talked about whether we can make a cheaper Da Vinci. So affordable surgical robotics is definitely another area. I know there is one company, I think it's called SS Innovations, which does
SS Mantra or SSI.
SSI Mantra, and they've now, I think, got US FDA approval. So that is, I think, going to be the other way because everyone wants these computerized things, but if talking about $1 million, $2 million, I don't think everyone can do that.
In fact, I came across a couple of other companies like Cure AI and SigTuple, which recently have got 510K in US.
Yeah, Cure AI has done very well. In fact, it touched being a unicorn for a few days and then I think it came back. But so that's a good company. So I think that would be great. And of course, there are others like, there's Niramai and Rosie and all of that who have done a very good job, in terms of, again, AI-powered diagnostics, which actually Niramai is gone, I think, going global. Yeah. So
that's correct. That's correct. Yeah. Abel?
Yeah, I think that I concur with what Alok said. I would only maybe offer the following suggestion. I think that the pure healthcare IT space, whether it's diagnostic or so on, is a very crowded space. And I think that, if you are launching a company today, I would actually do it differently. I would do it as a full stack medical device company, which is AI native. And what do I mean? I think you have the healthcare IT component, but I would also have a very, very cheap consumable, right? And the consumable then becomes almost the beachhead into the patient, right? Because the problem with healthcare IT is that you're dependent on the app stores. And the app stores are not, incented to help you get engagement, right? So there are very many healthcare IT applications that never get any much significant usage. So think full stack, think AI native. I think that's the way to go, right? With a very cheap consumable to get your foot in the door. I think that, yes, go ahead, Rajiv. I saw a note come through.
No. I think So I think we are nearing 5 p.m. So I guess we saw that message. But you can complete your point, Abel. Yeah.
No, that's my point. I'm done.
Okay, so I have a very important last question, which I wanted to ask both of you. Because I'm sure there are a lot of young people who are going to look it up, and I'm sure many entrepreneurs are also are being part of this call. So, what advice would you like to give to young innovators in India who aspire to build globally competitive medtech companies? And maybe Abel can share his experience as co-founder of Asia Pacific Mentor Circle here.
Yeah, thanks, Rajiv. Thanks for plugging it. Asia Mentor Circle is a initiative that was created. I have helped to co-found it with a few other senior medical device leaders. And our goal is to grow the next generation of leaders that will be head of region, not just for the GEs, the Philips, the Siemens of the world, but actually the next generation of unicorn medical device startups. It's really labor of love in the sense that it's focused over 6 months, over 500 hours of interaction across the entire cohort to help these people get to the next level, right? If you are a startup, to get to the next level of funding, global funding, right? If you are, a director, how do you become a senior director and eventually a vice president in a company like J&J? And I think that in my mind, if you think of the topics we've talked about, is done deliberately outside of government. It's done really on a pan-Asian wide basis. Interestingly enough, a very sizable number of our 68 mentees that we've had over the last 5 years have come from India. I will drop a link later on. I would welcome anyone that's listening to sign up and at least show interest, right? At least say, look, I'm here, right? And maybe I'll use this opportunity to answer a question that we had in the Q&A, where basically the complaint was India private funding, right? We don't have enough India private funding. And I would ask the individual that asked the question, right? Why just rely on India, right? How have you sent 1,000 invites outside of India to people to potentially come and fund your startup? And if you're not getting a good, kind of like readout from that, right? Have you changed and pivoted your startup to take on something that is more global, where investors are more interested in, right? I mean, I think that kind of mindset is what we will need to see to have what I call the next wave of Indian medical device unicorns. But thanks, Rajiv and Alok, for giving me a chance to share about Asia Mentor Circle.
Look, any views on this?
I totally agree with that, and which is why I was very keen that Abel share this, because the journey which you have if you are a MedTech innovator is long, and you have really no idea which bridges you'll need to cross. The mentors, the experienced people in this industry are the people who have the connections, the domain knowledge and things to give you advice. Now, it's not that they will teach you anything, but they might just say, okay, can you go and talk to this guy? I don't understand this. Okay, can you go and talk to Rajiv? Can you go and talk to such and such person? So I think, and maybe we need to talk to Abel about this. How can we replicate this in India, and of course connect it with people externally also? And you will find there's a lot of people, people from the different medtech companies and multinationals from different domains. Many of them, like me, are retired and things like that. But I think they will be very happy to at least talk to many of these people. So can we create that? Because you cannot train people to be that person giving advice, but they have to be people with that experience who are ready to share. And I think that will be that's the type of thing which Abel has done. And I know how many years it took him to actually get to that level. He had so many conversations with me and Supratim and all of that. But I think it's a very important part, and it is very critical for that, because one conversation with that person can totally change or take away a lot of stress in your mind. Like if you talk to Abel, he can give you 5 names outside of India who can get funding and stuff like that. So I think this is very important, and in my mind, that is possibly one of the most critical things for success. Other things we have enough engineers, doctors, and things like that.
Got it. I think so. Thank you, Alok and Abel, for this wonderful discussion. And we have 10 minutes to go, so I guess we could take a few questions. So the first question is from Yug Bansal. And what he writes is that he's been working in medical devices for 12 years. And he has built the organization from scratch. But he has funding issues for R&D. And I guess what he's saying is solving regulatory problems in all countries. I guess so. Maybe the key issue is the funding issue for R&D and regulatory issue in multiple countries. So I guess he's talking about how he could build, let's say, with this background, a global device. That is my understanding. I guess it's not complete, but that's what I understand from the question.
Alok, you
So I
want to
guess,
take a step?
yeah, yeah. So I guess
Hmm.
the main question is that how he could sort the funding issues for specifically for research and development.
Yeah, so I quite frankly can't comment on India, but in Singapore, people are going around with grants to give to people who want to develop anything. So, and I go back to what Abel had started earlier, and now every organization here is happy to give. There are proof of concept, proof of value, all types of grants. Now, I'm not sure whether that's there in India or not, and that's something which needs to be researched. I'm not very aware of those type of grants there. I don't know if Abel, you have any ideas about that?
I've spent a little bit of time with IISc in Bangalore, and I do know that they do have a grant system to help the companies that they're incubating go through the regulatory processes and so on. But I asked the fundamental question, right? The fundamental question is, if you are struggling with fundraising, are you solving the right problem? Right? I will start there, because very often, to be honest, I meet medical device entrepreneurs in India who have been, sacrificed their families, they sacrifice their lives, and they are working on things which are so small they will never get funded anywhere in the world anyway. And then they blame the Indian regulatory system, right? And for me, that's such a shame, because these are such outstanding individuals. The problem with them is that, for me, having difficulty finding funding is a signal that you're working on the wrong problem.
Yeah.
Right. So I would say this, I would encourage the individual that asked the question, at least make sure for yourself that you are trying to solve the right problem. Because if you have been pushing on it, and and regulatory is a very geographical thing, right? So you have a regulatory filing in Singapore, you have a regulatory filing in the US, you have a regulatory filing in India. Each of these places has got its own unique set of variants and quirks and so on and so forth, right? So I certainly wouldn't try and build a medical device company from the start going to 20 markets. It's the same as patenting, right? You wouldn't go out and patent a technology in 20 markets. Your company would, your startup would run out of money before you got the patents in the 20 markets. So I mean, just for the group's consideration.
The next question is also related to funding, wherein Sai Kamlesh is saying that the private funding is available only to those startups who have reached commercialization, and it needs to work for startups more effectively. But I guess so there is a private equity ecosystem in India. I mean, if I were to add to this, you have a venture capital ecosystem, you have a startup ecosystem, incubators. So I guess even if your product has not reached commercialization, you could always get funding from uh, you know incubators or let's say venture capital ecosystem. This is what my understanding is. Abel, would you like to
Yeah, sure.
comment on that?
Happy to answer. And like I want to maybe provide. I do think that the and I tried to talk a little bit about this question. I think that the question ultimately is, for whatever funds you have, right? And I'm assuming that Sai has already raised some funds. I would expediently use the funds you have to get to a regulatory milestone, right? Because investors fund milestones. Investors don't fund, work in progress, right? So if you get, 50 crore, 10 crore, 1 crore of funds into the company, size your regulatory milestone based on the funding that you have, right? Because if you do that, then the chances are you will hit a milestone and you will unlock the next tranche of funding. So I think that's the first point I would offer. The second point I would offer is this. We in the Advanced MedTech investment portfolio, we have a company called Sonar Motion. I will drop it into the chat later. And this is a company that has been able to get two 510K, well, I've got the balloons now, two 510K de novo approvals in the US. And actually, collectively, we have only spent $12 million US. right? So only slightly more than 120 crore Indian rupees, right? Two 510K de novo. So these are with full clinical trial and everything, right? And this is unheard of, right? And because they've only raised 125 crores of investment to get these two approvals, the founders still own 40% of this company, right? Imagine, if you are a founder and you exit for whatever number and you own 40%, right? That's a big chunk of value that you have created for yourself. So I just always suggest to the founders, whenever you raise funds, think about the fact that you are actually working more and more for your investors and less for yourself. So it's actually in your interest to use the money very judiciously, get to regulatory milestones, and right size how much you spend based on what you actually have. So those are some thoughts.
That's a great point. So the last one, I think the fourth one is more like a comment. So the last question is to Alok. Alok, with reference to global ambition, this is from Arun Prasad. Mindset play a big role, and I completely agree with that. How can medical schools or universities play a constructive role in cultivating this among students and incubators? Any best practices that you can share? This is the last question, and then lastly, I can see you. We'll call it off.
Yeah, I don't know whether schools and universities can do that, but this is, I think, something the individual should take on their own. I mean, today you can reach out to so many people in networks, and always people respond. Anyone who's ever reached out to me on LinkedIn, I have a Zoom call with them. So I think to be able to get a better view of this, it's a good idea to reach out to people yourself rather than wait for schools and universities to do this way.
Got it. So I guess we'll end today's discussion here, and we had a wonderful, 1 hour plus session with Alok and Abel, and I'll hand it over to now Lajji to give concluding remarks.
So thank you, Rajiv, Abel, and Alok, for a wonderful evening. I think we had a very insightful and also thought-provoking discussion. Some of the takeaways are very, very clear. Stop thinking about only import substitution. Look at the huge potential that exists globally. So build for scale, build for global, and that will give you an important roadway for growth. We had Able to talk about the triad of the need for medical, the engineering solutions, and the sourcing of capital being the framework for the growth that we are looking for, and interesting discussions on how to source intelligently. And we have no shortage of sources of resources across the world. So that's interesting, and there's a lot to learn from Alok and Abel about their experiences in various countries. The academia collaboration for growth in this sector also was discussed very appropriately, because there is still a lot of learning going on about how to get into the sector, and that will really make a difference. Plus the aspect about affordable, building the excellence in regulatory matters as well. I think this was also an interesting point that came up. All these points will remain in a recorded version on the IIMA YouTube channel. And I welcome people to refer back to the talk that in case they need it at any time in the future. And the panelists and Rajiv are all available at any time for direct interaction, and we will facilitate the discussion. Some of them are also on the IIMA Healthcare Alumni SIG. So on behalf of the IIMA Healthcare SIG, and on behalf of the Alumni and External Relations Office, a very big thank you to Rajiv, Alok, and Abel. And we look forward to more such discussions in this future, emanating from what has emerged from today's discussion. Special thank you for the support rendered by three important groups at IIMA. One is the Alumni and External Relations Office, the IT team, and the communications team for conducting this webinar. And to you participants, a very big thank you for your time and management engagement that you lent to our event. And we now declare the webinar has concluded and look forward to more such webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Have a great evening.
Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.